Alice materialized next to him, scolded him roundly for being destructive, and sent him off to wrap up more warmly against the river breezes. Then Anne Cressacre, another ward like me, managing in her irritating way to look artlessly pretty as she arranged her 15-year-old self and a piece of embroidery. In my view, there was no need for all of her humming and smiling. With all the money and estate she'd been left by her parents, father would have John marry her the day she came of age. Of all his wards, it was only me he seemed to have forgotten to marry off, but then I was several years too old to marry his only son. Anne Cressacre didn't need to try half so hard, especially since you could see from the doggy way John looked at her that he'd been in love with her all his life. The sun came out on young John's face as he came back, better dressed now for the gusty weather, and he screwed up his eyes against the harshness of the light. And suddenly the peevish ill temper that had been with me through a winter of other people's celebrations, a joint wedding for Cecily and Elizabeth and their husbands, followed by Christmas celebrations for our whole newly extended family, seemed to pass, and I felt a pang of sympathy for John. "Have you got your headache again?" I asked him in a whisper. He nodded, trying like me not to draw attention. His head ached all the time. His eyes weren't strong enough for the studying that made up so much of our time, and he was always anxious that he wasn't going to perform well enough to please father or impress pretty Anne. I put a hand through his arm and drew him away down the path to where we'd planted the vervain the previous spring. We both knew it helped with his headaches, but the clump that had survived was still woody and wintry. "There's some dried stuff in the pantry," I whispered. "I'll make you a garland when we get back to the house, and you can lie down with it for a while after dinner." He didn't say anything, but I could sense his gratitude from the way he squeezed my hand. Father was the only one who wasn't here. He was away somewhere, as he always was since we'd moved to Chelsea. Court affairs, the king's business. I lost count of what and where. But I had heard him promise Dame Alice when he set off that he'd be back as soon as the painter arrived. And I happened to see that in the morning she'd laid out some of his grandest clothes, the glistening fur-lined black cape, the doublet with the long gathered sleeves of lustrous velvet attached that were long enough to hide the hands whose coarseness secretly embarrassed him. He liked to believe he just wanted his portrait painted to return likenesses of himself to his learned friends in Europe, who were always sending him their pictures. But being painted in those clothes spoke of something more. Even in him, worldly vanity couldn't quite be extinguished. And so our eyes devoured the river in anticipation of displaying ourselves to Hans Holbein, the young painter sent to us from Basel by Erasmus, a living token of the old scholar's continuing affection for our family. Except me. Even if I was staring upriver as longingly as anyone else, I certainly wasn't looking for any German painter. No, I was waiting for someone else. And even if it was a secret, childish kind of waiting, even though I had no real reason to believe my dream was about to come true, it didn't lessen the intensity with which I found myself staring at each passing boat. I was looking for a face from the past, my hope for the future, the man I've always loved. John Clement came to live with us when I was 9, not long after my parents died, and I was sent from Norfolk to be brought up in Thomas More's family in London. He had been teaching Latin and Greek at the school that father's friend John Colet had set up in St. Paul's churchyard, and father and Erasmus and all the other friends of those days, Linacre and Grocyn and the rest, had made their passion. They were all enthusiasm and experiment back then, all father's learned friends. When the new king, Henry VIII, was crowned, and the streets of London were hung with cloth of gold for the coronation, they somehow got it into their heads that a new golden age was beginning, in which everyone would speak Greek and study astronomy and cleanse the church of its medieval filth. Erasmus once told me that the letter his patron, Lord Mountjoy, sent him, telling him to come to England at once, was half crazy with happiness and hope about the new King Henry. "The heavens laugh, the earth rejoices. All is milk and honey," it said. That milk and honey would surely have curdled if only they'd known that within 10 years one of Erasmus's European disciples, Brother Martin of Wittenberg, would have pushed their notion of religious reform so far that peasants all over the German lands